Welcome to the show. I am your host, Douglas Gabriel, and today my guest is John Barnwell. Today we're going to talk about the web of corporate oligarchy. Now, we have had conversations before, both sides of the bridge, talking politically and talking spiritually about such things. But what we get as a question all the time is, can you have John Barnwell talk again about the roots of how we got into an age that is called the age of falsehood politics, or the post-truth age, where it seems like a Hillary Clinton can do anything she wants and everyone in the entire world knows she's guilty, but nothing happens. And where it seems that the further towards the top you get, the more money you get, the more control you get, and absolutely the more lawless you get with absolute impunity. Now that's the part that I don't understand. How this oligarchy has gotten to the place where they don't seem to be able to be charged with a crime. So I know these things lie back in history, in the roots of history, and we have discussed this going back quite a ways. So John, can you give our listeners a bit of a leg up on this one and help them understand what this web of corporate oligarchy is all about?
Yeah, well, I can at least give them some cliff notes to work with. For those that really want to penetrate the veil of the corporate oligarchy, it's quite challenging, and it's intentionally so. Those who consider themselves the elite have layers upon layers of corporations and trusts in which they secrete their financial dealings. There's institutions that have been created to make this possible with the color of law. And when I say the color of law, meaning they can technically say that they are covered by the fact of that it's in a jurisdiction over which they have no power. And that is the shell game that is being played on the American people and on people all over the world, essentially. And so when you get into this, you got to kind of go through some periods where it's about as interesting as watching paint dry. And that's what makes it so unobtainable for the average citizen to come to an understanding of what they're going through, what their true status is as a citizen of the United States and as a corporate entity within the corporate entity that is the United States, Inc. And that's quite a maze to work through. And it's being facilitated by certain organizations, quasi-governmental organizations, like the group that I pointed you towards some time ago, the Senior Executive Service, who basically is put in place to be able to put forward initiatives from transnational corporations through no-bid contracts and basically just look away regarding dealings in which allegedly they have no jurisdiction. You say, well, why could that be the case? What is going on here in this big shell game? And really, to be able to trace this back is no mean feat. But I guess what we'll do, like we usually do, like in my other videos that I did with you, most specifically Liberty and Conscience versus the Institutional Left, we did back in September of 2017, they give some people some understanding of the workings of non-governmental organizations and how they interpenetrate government through lobbyists and through fundings of certain groups and so on and so forth. A good example today would be George Soros and his Open Society Foundation that is dedicated towards overturning the U.S. Constitution and making us just one of many zones within a transnational government. But in order to get to the bottom of this and how this could possibly be the case, we have to understand the history of law, and we have to understand the history of corporate structures and how they came into being. And in order to do this, we go back to the city of London and the city of the Vatican, which are city-states. And city-states have unusual status in that they are independent, essentially, of the countries in which they preside, and they have their own system of laws, or what you might call lawlessness, essentially. This was a particular modality that was borrowed from the city of Venice in their way of dealing with things through corporate structures, and also leads back to the Roman Empire. So let's start with the Roman Empire. And in England, they established a trading center on the River Thames, Londonium. And Londonium was basically 1 square mile walled in, and that was where they had a coliseum where they would throw Christians to the lions and have all kinds of quasi-sporting events and so on and so forth to entertain the local populace. Essentially, as that city established, it was formalized more so under Edward the Confessor, who was the last king of the House of Wessex. He lived from 1003 to 1066 is when he was brought down from his kingship by William the Conqueror, otherwise known as the Duke of Normandy, William the Bastard. He was a descendant of the Viking Rollo, and he was able to come into England, but he was not able to fully conquer the city of London. So he made a provision for them that they could continue with the existing rules of establishment that had been formalized by Edward the Confessor. And later on, King John, in June of 1215, was able to come to an agreement with the barons known as the Magna Carta, whereby it states the city of London shall have or enjoy its ancient liberties. So there you have a formalization of a structure that exists to this day and is basically ruled by the mercantile and other formalized businesses, which are the merchants. And they have different trading organizations for all manner of businesses, from haberdashers to now they have it for technology even. And through these structures within the city of London, they're able to play a shell game to such an extent that many of the big banks in America, for example, have offices in London so that they can conduct business practices whereby it's free from the prying eyes of anybody here in the United States, or what we might call economically the colonies. And as the British Empire was into its demise, they were really concerned with how they were going to maintain their wealth structure, and so they retreated into the financial sector and centered it within the city of London. And the city of London is now responsible for being the center of a nerve organization that presides over a series of tax havens. There's the Isle of Man, which is a low-tax financial center, but then there's the other tax havens that are more profound, the Channel Islands of Jersey and Guernsey, the Cayman Islands is quite well known, Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, and the Bahamas. And through these tax-free havens, many of the wealthy and the uber-wealthy are able to focus their financial empires through these institutions, through the City of London. And so roughly half of the global offshore wealth is hidden within these British jurisdictions, over which the British government, for the UK itself, says they have no jurisdiction. And involved in that whole construct is the corporate United States, of which perhaps Today we can get into a little bit of the underlying history.
So this is basically institutionalized corruption that is legal in Britain, but not legal here in America. But the British systems have come to America.
Exactly. And you say, well, how could that be? Well, I'm quite a fan of our founding fathers. And it's interesting because in 1803, there was a judgment which was just mentioned yesterday, I saw on television. They still mention this as one of the principles of American jurisprudence that can be resorted to if they need a precedent. And it's Marbury versus Madison in 1803, 5 U.S. 2 Cronch 137, 174, 176. And again, that was in 1803, where it says, all laws which are repugnant to the Constitution are null and void. So we always have that in our back pocket as a means to be able to come to terms with some of the machinations of these transnational corporations. But nonetheless, we've been suffering beneath this for quite some time, going back to the early days of the United States. From 1754 to 1776, we have the United Colonies that come together in the first and second Continental Congresses. Now, these were the Philadelphia Congresses. And it was a convention that came together of the 13 colonies to try and create a governing body for a federation of states. And that was something that would go through 3 different incarnations. And it's hard to get into a lot of details on this because it becomes too tedious. I would recommend people look up Timeline of the Great Fraud by Judge Anna von Reitz. Whether or not one agrees with every one of her conclusions, you can't deny that she gives you a basis for research. But essentially in 1776, as we all know, or we're supposed to all know, the colonies did declare their independence through the Declaration of Independence. And in 1781, there was an article of confederation to bind the states as a political subdivisions of United Colonies. But it became a confederation, which is kind of interesting, rather than a confederation rather than a federation. And see, what you have here is the workings of legal language, which complicates matters greatly. But in essence, what we do is we move forward. And people don't realize this, but in the Treaty of Paris and the Treaty of Versailles, the splitting of the land and the sea jurisdictions between the states and the federal union placed King George III as the trustee over American interests in the high seas and in the navigatable island waterways. People don't realize that we had given up that power to Britain that early in 1783. And it's quite troubling, but as you follow the line of development, it goes through various iterations, which essentially will lead to, in 1812, the War of 1812, where the British come in and they try to grab back some of the power that they had given up. And it's kind of tricky, but it was held back through the Treaty of Ghent. But in essence, it is able to create a peace, but that is only for so long until in 1845, the British monarch and the Pope, they secretly agree to undermine the system of American government in the Treaty of Verona. So there's this unending assault against the sovereignty of the United States through these British and Vatican foreign interests. And the end game of it, without getting bogged down with a lot of details, but essentially establishing within the United States the acceptance of the system of corporation. And through treating corporations as persons, they were able to develop rights for corporations that should not be extended to them. During the time of Thomas Jefferson, corporations were considered to be formations or legal structures that were created for a specific purpose, and once that purpose was accomplished, they would be disbanded. Now we have these corporations in perpetuity, and this is becoming more and more problematic. Just this morning, I was watching a video of Catherine Austin Fitts, who is the former Deputy Secretary of Housing with Dr. Farrell, and they were talking about some of the provisions that have become in the forefront recently. And you kind of wonder, this whole idea about gender and sexual identity, and it has put in the forefront all these issues about transgender and all of this, and everybody's going like, what's the point with all this? Why are they doing this? But I think that Catherine Austin Fitts has kind of solved a riddle on that, and that's that the existing economic system is laid out in such a way so that it makes provision for dealing with persons, with individuals, with citizens, primarily meaning people, but also meaning corporations. And by taking this language and being able to get to the point to where they want to put through a so-called birth certificate that has gender neutral, what that can do is it creates a way in which a system of robotics can overlaid into the realm of identity politics as a person, such as the computer talking head that was made a citizen in Saudi Arabia. As absurd as all this may seem, this is their game plan to where they don't have to rewrite the whole economic structure, but they can just insert AI and robotics into our existing system as a measure of control.
So that's why you now call it the web of corporate oligarchy. And we pointed out that these oligarchs at the top, from the beginning, had their fingers in the web and everything digital and all information, because they knew that information was the next battlefield. And so Hillary Clinton with Axion, which was in trust before that, and it was a British company through Canada, Nortel to begin with, basically puts a tax on every single thing that happens on the internet. Every single communication has to be verified, certified, and the encryption codes have to be matched. And Hillary, through a company that basically a buffoon of hers, Jerry C. Jones from Rose Law Firm, this one person now controls this, and they moved to Shanghai. Well, what we're talking about here is exactly the fact that the oligarchs had to get control of the mechanism of the web, because most of world economy started to be placed on the internet. It was an accident. It's a weaponized PSYOP system that was used for something completely other. But then when economy started to be based on the internet, the oligarchs had to get their piece of the pie. They used to, just as you say, use offshore accounts and digitally move money that they didn't pay any taxes on to offshore accounts where they never paid taxes on it. And most of the British members of parliament have an offshore account. As a matter of fact, this was a big issue about a year ago, that they were going to make a law that they had to tell everyone the money that's in their offshore accounts. And they debated this for months because that's not the way it's done. They're destroying the system you've described, which is a group of old boys sitting around in a club speaking a secret language about their investments that nobody knows anything about. And I always like the way you describe it. It's a bunch of committees that nobody knows who's on the committees. And the big committee, the Queen's Privy Council, maybe we'll come back to that in a minute, but it's this web. So I like the fact that you focused on this in a way to show that the oligarchs truly do want to control the web.
Yeah, well, It's something that the more you look at, the more disturbing it is, because essentially what you have is a system of what are called trusts. And these are unregistered trusts that function through the City of London by way of these offshore institutions. And there is no legal mechanism to be able to even find out who is in the center of these trusts. And I know within the research that you and Michael McKibben and others have been trying to do, when you start looking under the hood and trying to figure out, okay, well, who runs this? And you look and you go, well, it just says some trust, or there's just some corporation, and then you find that corporation's owned by another corporation. So it's all shrouded in obscurity so that you can't even figure out who's doing what to whom and who owns what. And that's all perfectly intentional. And that could easily be set aside with a simple stroke of a pen by the president, and utilizing Madison versus Marbury as the legal precedent for so doing, because these types of institutions and their overlay within the U.S. Frame of government is entirely unconstitutional. And likewise with things that are over us, such as the Patriot Act, that, of course, was revised by President Obama to be made even worse. But at this stage in the game, I think that President Trump is in need of the provisions of the Patriot Act in order to be able to go after some of the treasonous activity of the bad actors within the American system, and their entanglement with the bad actors coming out of the City of London. You know, people like Sir Malak Brown, or Sir Geoffrey Patty, or Sir Richard Dearlove, who are behind this whole effort to overthrow President Trump's presidency.
Boy, you hit that one on the head. Did you see that Sir Richard Dearlove was out there giving us his opinion, which we really don't need, ex-head of the MI5. By the way, the MI5 sent over Robert Hannigan to spy on Trump through Fort Meade, Maryland, in collusion with, because there are Five Eyes, in collusion with the head of the CIA, John Brennan. And then Richard Dearlove controlled Christopher Steele and his political monkey wrench, the Russian dossier. So, Richard Dearlove, you are a spy, you are our enemy, you are a war actor. This is if you worked with Americans, anyone who worked with you during this is now treasonous and seditious. And I just want Richard Dearlove to simply go to jail, or at least be called out as the head guy who was controlling this. So, you know, we don't have to go far. We can name the players here, and they all go back to the British Queen's Privy Council, whether it be Sir Geoffrey Patty, Sir Malak Brown, Sir Richard Dearlove, and the whole host of them. There's how many people in the Privy Council? I think almost 500, and each one of them is a corporate warlord that actually works directly alongside George Soros. As a matter of fact, Lord Malak Brown was one of the, I believe, founding members of George Soros's Open Society Foundation. So when we're talking about it, we're talking about the evil warlords who not only control the news through their propaganda machines, called in the British Privy Council, they use the Strategic Communications Laboratory. Cambridge Analytica was part of that group. They're now closing down. Or they use things like Serco, a company that has $86 billion in fraud charges being brought against them, all run out of the people who are in the Privy Council, that go right into our American system, both corporate, military, everything. So when you look closely, you might say, well, Lockheed Martin, what a great American company, one of the second highest contractors for the American defense. Wrong. It's owned by the Queen. She owns the golden share, and Lockheed is not owned by Americans. And so you start looking closely, and you find that this old system of the oligarchs that was put in play by, well, we also have to remember that there's a 4,000-year-old institution that's been going on all along. We could go there, but I'll let you just pick up on that if you want. The 2,000-year-old system is, of course, the Vatican. It's an institution, been going on for 2,000 years. And how long have the Brits been doing the City of London? You just heard John say. We're talking about things that have been going on for centuries or millennia, and it's pretty hard to change the power and control structure that they have built because it is so deeply woven into the fabric that it is almost impossible to take it out.
Yes, that's truly the case. And the further one looks at it, the more you realize the courage that's being shown by President Trump and the way in which he's point by point pushing back on these types of transnational operations, which essentially are here to undermine our sovereignty as individual human beings, and that it's not a political issue. It's a spiritual issue, meaning that the expression of the spirit as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, that our God-given rights of liberty, they're not something that is assigned to us through some government. The government was meant to be that which safeguards those liberties and our freedom. And so it's kind of gotten out of hand and has become something that has become a thorn in our side. I mean, if you're talking about tracing it back, as early as the First Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great, he created what was called the Charter of the Rights of Nations in 583 BC. And it defined the democratic principle of rulership, which is consent of the governed. And this charter was on the Cyrus cylinder that was found in the Akkadian cuneiform script in 1879. And basically near Baghdad, the city of current-day Baghdad. And so a man of vision like Cyrus the Great, who was able to see that it was necessary that there was a decentralization of rulership, or rather governance. We don't want to be ruled. We want to be governed. We want to empower individuals to represent us. We don't want to be ruled by oligarchs, which is what these people are attempting to do, and create the architecture through technology to be able to rule us, rather than to be governed through a decentralized system, which is provided for by the states of the Union, and not to have merely just this overriding dream of Al Gore that there's going to be this system that's financed through carbon tax. I mean, it's interesting to note why carbon, but nonetheless, on the periodic table, carbon is item number 6. It has 6 electrons, 6 protons, and 6 neutrons. So there we have our 666. It kind of makes one nervous a little bit when you think about it, but there it is, plain as day. And so why would they want this carbon tax? Well, that's to finance a transnational government, which would be anathema to human freedom. It would be the worst possible thing that could happen. And so to see President Trump setting aside the dictates of the United Nations is such a wonderfully healthy thing. And to see the recent developments of really our representative in the UN stepping down, which I think is a good thing, because she doesn't seem to understand what President Trump is trying to do, or perhaps she does understand it and she's just in full disagreement because she's a globalist.
Well, I'm happy she's stepping down. And the reason she's stepping down is she's not going to have a job anymore. He's pulled out all the money from the UN. I don't know any part of the UN he hasn't taken money from, and he's basically saying he's not going to pay his dues. They can send the bill, but since they don't do the work, don't pay him. And by the way, you can use that with these lawyers too, who, they call themselves esquires. They become landed gentry so that they can work in the courts in the inns of where the city of London, right outside the city of London, are these courts, inns of courts, and where basically the lawyers are trained in a system that has led to the fact that we have fake justice here in America based upon this ridiculous system of law that came out of the city of London. But when we go way back, as you like to do, I'm going to go even back further in this one here, John. To begin with, we had these priest kings who told us what to do. Like you say, we don't want to be ruled, we want to be governed. In the old days, we had these priest kings. I mean, somehow they had a direct connection. Some thought they were half God, half man. And it was generally an old boys club from the time that we can remember, from about 2000 BC forward. And they were priest kings, and they were the rulers. And then after that, you got the ridiculous notion of the divine right of kings, mixed in with the ecclesiastical authority of canon law that said that anybody in their old boys club that gets elected to a position of a bishop, archbishop, pope, whatever, that somehow they're more directly connected with the divine, just like the kings and the divine right of kings, of monarchs. The divine right of kings? Go back and look at the British kings and their history. That's the worst group of perverts and crazy people that you could ever study. Some are really cool, but others, that is a shameful, shameful history. Actually, I have a degree in history, and it's focused on British history, so I'm not making this up. But after that, of course, then when the Vatican basically thought it was so in control of the world that it could just draw a line through the world and say, above that, I'm given to Spain, below that, I'm given to Portugal. Oh, no, maybe I'll throw in Italy. The Pope thought the Pope controlled the world. Well, they found out through the Protestant Reformation and through the 30 Years' War and many other wars that the Pope, who was in fact a ruler at one point, shouldn't be and was no more directly connected to the divine than a donkey. So now what do we get in England? We get the most beautiful thing. It actually started in the cities of Hamburg, and as you pointed out, started in Venice. The banking systems of Venice moved to Hamburg, and then it moved to Amsterdam, to the Dutch, and then it moved to Britain. And so if you look at the British and Dutch East India Company, which was some of the first corporations, they began to rule, or they called it trading with a sword. They ruled the oceans, they ruled trade, they ruled economy, and they were more powerful than the nations that they arose from. And it is those two corporations, the British East India Company and the Dutch East India Company, that basically founded America and created the North and the South, because the British East India Company were in the North and the Dutch East India Company brought slaves to the South. And this type of commerce that happened got into our system, and it just doesn't seem to be able to get out. And so we've pointed out that the source of it in America politically is the senior executive service members, who basically make sure nothing ever changes and that it always goes to the same old corporations who, if you look behind them, are the same corporations behind the British and Dutch East India Company. And you and I have had discussions about this and wondered whether or not the American Revolution ever ended. And perhaps we're still in it, based upon these kind of historical insights.
Yeah, it does make you wonder. I mean, in 1810, there was what's called the Title of Nobility Amendment, and it was a proposed amendment of the 11th Congress, and they passed it on May 1st, 1810, and submitted it to state legislatures for ratification, which would strip citizenship from any citizen who accepted a title of nobility from emperor, king, prince, or foreign power. Of course, it only came within 2 states of the number needed to become part of the Constitution back in 1812 and 1816. They didn't set a time limit for its ratification, so it's still pending. They can still pass it.
It's got my vote.
It's interesting that one of the titles of nobility is Esquire, which is a title given to somebody who practices at the bar, who practices law. And what people don't understand is that the Bar Association, per se, and the legal structure of our government is beneath the purview of the legal system within England, and that they are titled Esquire beneath the crown.
And I feel like I'm an unlanded gentry, a common person, a plebeian, when I go before a judge, because I'm not a lawyer, and therefore I'm literally mistreated. And if you are a lawyer, you think you're privileged when you're in the court, and we have to pay literally to have somebody represent us because we're in this old, dead legal system of the Romans. We are still in the ghost of the Roman legal system, and that's the canon law. And then with the British system, that was maritime law. And then there's like a merchant law. And then they wanted to pass TPP, which would have said corporations can sue countries, entire countries. A corporation can sue a country if they simply break a trade deal with them, or even lower what that corporation is making off of a trade deal. This was to be the ultimate law of basically lawlessness on the high seas. This was to be true pirate economy with the TPP and the TIPP and NAFTA. As we saw, we lost $5 trillion with NAFTA. This is pirate economy based upon saying America is there, and we're going to turn her into a socialist country whether they like it or not. So we as foreign countries are going to come and take our part. But, the Pope takes his part. And if you look at the refugee program, the Pope is really hurting. The Pope's gone nuts, as a matter of fact, because he lost so many hundreds of billions of dollars because of the refugee program being canceled in America. It's unbelievable. But these are the people who they then human traffic, and of course, they sexually molest them if they happen to be someone of their choice. But most of the time, it's not even the Catholic Church doing these placements of refugees. So when you see canon law that says the Pope cannot make a mistake, anytime he speaks an encyclical, it is the word of God. It is 100% truth. That's simply poppycock. Look at his words now. He says the craziest things in the entire history of the Catholic Church. Look at the Queen, and look at what's happening in Britain. These are not institutions we wish to follow. So we have laid out a plan, and John, you've been part of it all along in helping us to attack with information and show the indictable evidence of who these people are, what they're doing, and how we can go after them. And that is what really needs to happen. We need to use information truly as a sword to basically cut off the head of ignorance and find this very small group of people, and it isn't a big group of people, who are doing these things based upon the rat lines, the evil channels of money and greed and hate and lust and all these sick outcroppings of these institutions. We simply cut that off. And there are many simple ways to do this. We always go into this in our audio, so we want to give people hope. Yes, these systems are thick, but we've already seen that Serco is losing its contracts. We saw that Strategic Communications Laboratories, Cambridge Analytica, they're gone. If Serco goes down, then they go down in America too. We're going after Axion. We're going after Hillary Clinton. We're going after George Soros. We're going after the people, Lord Malik Brown, Jeffrey Patty, that we can literally get leverage on to get inside of this web of corporate oligarchy and take down one oligarch at a time if we have to.
Yeah, I think that that's the key. And you'll see, I think, as we get past this midterm election, that there's going to be new developments coming out of the Trump administration. Now, one key target that I think may take his second term to get to, it has to do with getting rid of the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve, there's nothing federal about it, and they have no reserves. It's basically banksters that call themselves the Federal Reserve that bought the Government Services Corporation, the United States of America, in which they're in control of printing money from just paper, and then putting us into debt by acquiring it. And because of the system of basically payola, they've been able to move along. And I remember back during the financial debacle of 2008, there was a call to audit the Federal Reserve. Boy, that was shut up real quickly. And ultimately, there has to be an auditing of the Federal Reserve. And at this point, it's a secret who owns the Federal Reserve. I mean, we can figure out, that it's the banking houses, the Rothschilds and the Warburgs and the Schiffs and so on and so forth. But essentially, this whole superstructure of international banking has been behind these foreign wars that we've been so entangled in. I mean, that was what brought down Libya, was the fact that they did not participate in the central banking system. And so any country that dares to break away or not participate in the central banking system is in peril from these international banksters. But the clearest indication in my mind that Donald Trump is a true patriot was his setting aside the TPP and all those related acts and the various treaties that have been against American interests. That shows his dedication to reestablishing sovereignty. But he wants to establish sovereignty for all the individual nations of the world. He's not trying to establish an empire. He is trying to reestablish individual sovereignty as citizens so that we can have other nations as trading partners on a one-to-one basis rather than dealing with this web of transnational corporations. And so as we look at the progress of his developments, which has been absolutely spectacular in my mind, I just see good things coming ahead in the midterm election.
You're so right. This is really takes me back to the moment that George H.W. Bush said that the New World Order was absolutely going to take over. And he made that speech in the United Nations, and now today, as you point out, even the head of our representative to the United Nations wants to get out because there's really going to be no more work there because, as you have pointed out, we are not ready for what I would call the loving Christian attitude that's necessary for internationalism, for globalism. Country fights with country. People fight with people. Religions fight with religions. Sexes fight with sexes. It's ridiculous. We are not ready to go into some type of shared world global community unless you want to have shared global world rulers, which will come down to just a few rulers. Let's look at the way that this worked with the United Nations. Complete failure. The peacekeeping forces do anything but that. You might as well call them the rape forces, who literally stand around watching murder and murder themselves. The World Health Organization, they're giving out Bill Gates' poisonous vaccines and killing people. It's not about health, it's about death, it's about eugenics. We go right down the list of everything with the United Nations. Let's take the European Union. Oh yes, let's join together in the European Union so we can do what? Listen to one man, George Soros. Whatever he says, that's what they're doing. Look at the turnaround on the anti-crusade Muslim invasion of Europe, which he planned, which was to create utter chaos so that he could take great advantage of the European Union Central Bank, because George Soros is about attacking any country without a central bank, because then he can manipulate their currency and cause things to crash, go in, swoop in as an economic hawk, grab it for a little, and sell it for a lot later when the country gets back on its feet. He's done this 14 times that I know of. He's doing it in America now, and we need to stop him. The European Union is an exact, perfect example of what happens with globalism. It almost happened here in America with Hillary, and that would have been the end of us. Mexico and Canada would have become part of America, and they would have simply become the 55th nation in the Commonwealth of the United Kingdom, of the Queen of Britain. And the Pope, remember, the Queen takes vows of fealty in the Knights of Malta. Now, for a while, it was literally directly to Pope Francis, but now he's replaced the head of the Knights of Malta with someone he likes. But basically, the Queen takes her orders from the Vatican, and Washington, D.C., and New York, and Hollywood, they're one and the same, take their directives directly from the Queen. And who sits right there with the Queen and doing business with all of her Privy Council members? That would be George Soros. So George Soros is yet another tool of the Queen's Privy Council. So this web of corporate oligarchy goes back thousands of years. We have found ways to cut the ties. End internationalism. If it's an international company, I suggest that we do no military-industrial complex business with them whatsoever. I also suggest that anyone that we buy materials from, that they have to buy an equal amount of something else from us. I suggest that we first freeze the assets of all the central banks and the U.S. Federal Reserve, audit it, take all the assets, and close it down. We don't need it. We never needed it. They're simply those Hamburg German bankers, the Dutch bankers, and the British bankers, exactly as you said. That's who controls the U.S. Federal Reserve by ownership of companies that are proxy owners of other companies. It's always the same group of asset management companies. But you won't find who, as John has just pointed out, who really owns those companies. But they're always the same group. And so what we say is, end any relationship with internationalism that isn't either reciprocal, and any relationship, reciprocal, fair, honest, no tariffs, or end any relationship with anything to do with national security with any country. The Five Eyes cannot be trusted. They've shown that over and over and over again. And we don't need a surveillance state. So we can end all of that. And we can simply say, we're going to do business. For instance, our microchips need to be made in America. Our weapons need to be made in America. Everything nuclear needs to be done in America. Guess who owns our nuclear? Well, Uranium One showed it was Putin fighting with the Queen for America's uranium. In America's ground, uranium coming out of American ground was fought over by Putin, literally by Putin and the Queen, literally for 10 years under the guise and protection of Robert Mueller and Andrew McCabe. We've revealed this in all of our intelligence reports over on the Aim for Truth site. So what I'm saying is, these old institutions are easy to end once you find out how deep their tentacles go. And we've given suggestion after suggestion, and Trump is taking up many of them. We say, no more OPEC. What? A month later, he cuts OPEC in half. We say U.S. aid is fake. He says, we're not going to do it that way anymore. We told him, get rid of the UN. He's cut over half of the funds to the UN. We told him, to do this and that. What? Why? Because he's a genius, and because anybody should know these things, that is really honest, careful, and has discernment. So we like to say that, we read between the lines of the Trump tweets, but what we're really doing is simply following the patterns of logic and simply following the patterns of evil and trying to undo them.
Well, so perhaps we can end on the words of President Trump himself. We will never surrender American sovereignty to an unelected global bureaucracy. America is governed by Americans. We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embraced a doctrine of patriotism.